Hi, welcome to the series of SketchUp tutorials for virtual site modeling. This series is broken down to 4 parts. Part 1 introduces SketchUp, process of downloading it, and the interface with some useful techniques, which brings us to Part 2, the heart and soul of the series. We'll be creating a basic city block from start to finish. Part 3 covers different problem case scenarios that you may run into. If you have any issues when working on a site model, Part 3 might be a great reference for you. At last, in Part 4, I will also provide animation techniques in SketchUp, which can be really helpful if your project requires a video production. For each of the videos, I will provide exercise file links under the description of the video. I will also list out a timestamp so that you can look for exactly what's helpful to you. So let's get started. Why use SketchUp for site modeling? SketchUp is one of the more user-friendly 3D modeling software out there, and it's capable of creating high-quality production, whether it's architectural rendering or site plan modeling. In this series, I will only be focusing on site plan modeling for urban planning and design, with a few tips that could be helpful for architecture and landscape architecture students. Since EMVD places a strong emphasis on Rhino, I thought of pointing out a couple differences from my knowledge between the two when creating a site model. Rhino operates by typing commands, whereas in SketchUp, you don't use commands. SketchUp models are created by mesh surfaces, meaning that the surfaces are created by planar geometry, and with Rhino, surfaces are created by NURBS, which has a built-in calculation that helps create the geometry. In the later segment of Part 1, I'll demonstrate how to create surfaces that resemble those from Rhino, where you can't really tell the differences. Rhino is compatible with EMVD's laser cutting machines, and generally recommended for that purpose. And I'm not exactly sure about SketchUp's compatibility with laser cutters. That's something you might want to check out with the DMC. Both SketchUp and Rhino are compatible with 3D printing machines. And CNC-wise, I can't speak for that either, since I've never used it before, and I recommend asking the staff at the sink. SketchUp is very capable of animation, and it can be very useful when your team tries to compose a video production of the project. I can't speak for Rhino, because I've never used animation in Rhino before. Both pieces of software are capable of exporting the models into Illustrator file format for further editing and coloring. My personal impression with SketchUp is that it's great for simple modeling. It's capable of complex modeling, like Zaha Hadid-style organic architecture. It's just that you'd have to install extensions or plugins to make it happen. Rhino has a lot of functions you can apply just from the built-in extension. Though usually when creating urban scale site models, you're less likely asked to generate complex geometries. The emphasis is usually more on the urban form. All that is to say, both pieces of software get the job done in very different fashion, and one isn't necessarily better than the other. It just depends on which one you feel more comfortable with. For SketchUp version to download, I recommend SketchUp Studio for students because it covers everything SketchUp Pro offers and beyond that. If you want more details on the different SketchUp versions, I linked the video on the top right screen that you can access to. For SketchUp Studio student version, they offer an enormous discount from a whopping $1,199 to $55 a year, and after a year you will have to renew it. In my case, my version expires in a week, so I thought it would be a perfect time to demonstrate the process of downloading it. So I'll type in SketchUp Studio for students, then higher education, plans and pricing for students, standard 1-year license download, Once you check out, the page prompts you to contact and payment info, and once you fill those in, it assigns you an order number and a link where you will upload your academic proof. You'll also receive a confirmation email. For the academic proof, you'll need the enrollment verification certificate in the Buff portal. I'll type in enrollment verification. Then view your enrollment verification. Current or all enrollment, either one works. Make sure that the most current term is correct. Sometimes it doesn't update, and in that case you'll have to contact the registrar office. This creation engine page was from the link that was underlined in green earlier, and this is where you will submit the document. After a couple days, you should receive a confirmation email that lists the renewal start and end dates. Because it's a studio version, you won't have a license number, nor will you have a serial code. Since SketchUp is linked to my email account, it automatically updates my annual subscription to January of 2022, and that's the process of obtaining SketchUp Studio Student version. To set up, we're going to open up SketchUp. Choose Urban Planning as our template, and that will be our template for the rest of the tutorials. By the way, if you ever forget and want to check on the status of your subscription, you're able to see your subscription status right here. And this is probably what your interface looks like initially, or it could be slightly different. This is your standard toolbar. If you hover to the left and hold down your mouse, you can move that toolbar around anywhere you like, and I like to move it to the left side. Also, you won't see the extension option if you just downloaded SketchUp for the first time. You will when you start installing extensions, which we will cover in part 2. I'm actually not going to explain any of the tools here because most are self-explanatory if you play around with them, and I'll be applying these tools constantly down the stretch, so you won't miss a chance learning most of them. Next thing I want to do is to bring up the default tray. For part 1, I will be focusing on explaining some of these features, but before kicking off explaining them, one more thing I want to make sure is that the units are appropriate. So it's under feet, which is good, and I'm going to keep the format as decimal. Actually, one more thing I want to point out. If you go under Preferences, here you can create shortcuts for some tools you'll be frequently using, and you can also change the template here if for any reason you need to. The reason I want to explain some of the functions from the default tray before getting started with site model creation is because some of them aren't as explanatory as the standard tools from the toolbar. You can technically not use the default tray and create a site model, but the uses of the tray is like finessing in Photoshop or Illustrator and enhances the quality so much more. If you do want to hide the default tray at times, just click on the pin button here, and if you want to lock it, just click on it again to lock the tray. In these tutorials, we'll be using entity info, materials, styles, shadows, tags, and scene. There are more features if you go under Windows and Default Tray. There's Fog, Match Photo, Soften Edges. We will be using Soften Edges for terrain creation in part 3, but not for site model creation tutorial in part 2. If you created a site model, but you don't want the sketch lines, that's when you go under Styles to adjust the line weights, or simply to turn them off. Under Edits, you'll find Edges and Profiles checked. If you want a thinner line weight, you can adjust the value of the profile to 1, and if you don't want the line weights at all, just uncheck both the edges and the profile. It's important to check how the model looks without the lines when you apply colors. Sometimes they might look nice when working with the lines, but once the lines are turned off, in this case, as you notice that the similarity of the colors makes it harder to read the site plan. Also, make sure that the colors of the outer rim of your site model isn't too similar with your background color. You can change your background color under Select. For example, Construction Documentation Style, which gives you a white background color. Something I find pretty cool, if you go under Assorted Style, this one gives you a hand sketch effect, which could be helpful if you're trying to show more conceptual iterations. For the shadows, you probably had some experience creating sunshade diagrams for your project. You can create shadow comparison in the morning, afternoon, and in the late afternoon, and you can also compare between different seasons. Make sure that On Faces is checked. If it isn't checked, the shadows won't reflect on the ground surface. You can also adjust the brightness of the shadows, and just a heads up that if you export your 2D graphics as PDF or EPS, it does not include the background like PNG or JPEG does, but it doesn't include the shadows either. If you want the shadows, I'd recommend exporting it as PNG or JPEG and delete the background afterwards in Photoshop. Also, the shadows are accurate in this model because I geolocated beforehand. If you imported the model straight from 3D Warehouse, the model might not recognize the coordinate system, thus produce inaccurate shadow patterns. To address that, I linked a video on the top right that demonstrates how to create accurate shadows from 3D Warehouse models. Also, when you work on your site model, if not necessary, you want to keep the shadows off. Having the shadows on is the major reason that slows down the workflow. Tag is the same concept as layer. If you use version 2019 or prior, it would be called layers. In SketchUp, it's critical that you don't tag every component because that can create issues down the road. If you have tagged every component in your project, it's very likely you have encountered some problems, and the solution is explained in part 6. Generally, the only times when you tag something are tree models and cars. Those are ones that you import from the 3D Warehouse, and usually I would also tag buildings that I create. Here you do see roads, paths, and many others under tags that have PM label at front. Those are generated when you geolocate, which I'll cover in part 2. With trees and cars, you're likely to have a bunch of them in a site model, and it's important to tag them so that you can toggle them on and off. With 3D Warehouse models, depending on the file size when you import them, they also slow down SketchUp. If for no specific reason, it's better to keep them hidden to accelerate the workflow. Entity info is used when you're trying to tag an object under a layer. For example, I'm going to create a random block and I want to tag it under buildings. Its current state is untagged and I'm going to choose buildings. Now that it's tagged under building, you can toggle it on and off as you wish. You can also use entity to calculate an area, and in this case I'll calculate the area of this parking lot. Another feature for using entity info is to increase accuracy of a curved geometry. I'm going to turn the lines back on and draw a simple circle. As you can see, the circle consists of segments of lines, and to smooth it out, if you click on the outer rim and go to Entity Info, you can increase the line segments to 60, for example. It might increase your file size a bit, but having worked with some of these models, I haven't yet noticed a decrease of workflow speed that shadows and trees manifest. For materials, there are a wide variety to choose from. I generally use plain colors for the site model, because the scale is a lot smaller than an architectural rendering, that the patterns are often invisible from an aerial view. The shortcut for coloring is B. You can color the streets with a different color, for example. If you want to recolor the buildings, instead of applying the new color one at a time, you can hold down your Shift key, then press B to color them all at once. Make sure that nothing is selected when you try that. A couple buildings weren't colored, which means they had a different color from the others, even though they looked the same. I'll hit Control or Command Z for the last step. And these buildings are grouped now. If you double click, that edits the group. So this one is white, and this one is default color. You want to make sure the buildings that are grouped are under default color. As you draw any shape, that's your default color. And it's better not to color them white, as it creates limitations on what you could do later on. If there's a specific color you like and wish to apply to somewhere else, there's the eyedropper. A shortcut for that on a PC is Alt, and on a Mac is Command. As you hold down the key, I'll pick this lighter gray and apply it to this smaller parking space. For coloring, you can also apply the color theme that your group picked in Illustrator and apply them in SketchUp. That's covered in Part 3 of Problem and Solutions. Scenes can be used to save certain perspective images. In this case, I had the trees unhidden in the model when I saved the scene. That's why the trees appear. To save the scene, rotate to any view you prefer by holding down your scroll wheel on your mouse. If you want to move the scene without rotating, just hold down your Shift key and the scroll wheel. Then just hit Add Scene. Let's say that you want to include shadows in the scene. You can turn it on. Like I said, the shadows slow down your SketchUp file quite a bit, so just waiting for it to appear. Once the shadows appear, right-click and update the scene, and make sure that camera location is on, otherwise the scenes won't change. Sometimes SketchUp crashes when you try to update the scene with shadows, so just a heads up, unless you're creating an animation, rules of thumb, keep the shadows at bay. You can rename scenes by going to the top bar here, and you can move the sequences of the scenes with the arrows. More important when you create animations. If you want to delete, just click on the minus button. Another way to access it, if you like keeping the default tray hidden, is by going to View, Animation, and you have options to add, update, or delete scenes. For animating the scenes, I'll cover that in Part 4 that's dedicated to animation content.